Welcome Secretary Howard Lutnick of the U.S. Department of Commerce and Ben Smith of Semafor.
You're already getting applause. Well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you for joining us, Secretary. I want to start with the big picture. I think I last saw you in Davos. You were forecasting 6% growth for this year. What does that look like now?
So you just had, in the last week, the fastest turnaround in equity markets in 36 years. The Straits of Hormuz were just announced an hour ago that they're open, and ships are moving. So the price of oil dropped 10% this morning. So the opportunity, the concept of changing the global threat level is fundamental. And I think what's happened is we have Stockholm syndrome. We're used to terrorism being part of our society. And the concept of breaking terrorism is a unique concept that hasn't really been driven into the risk premium of the world. If you actually have a positive outlook for the future and you eliminate the risk premium or dramatically halve it or 75% lower, the economic growth of the world will demonstrably grow. I think the fundamentals of the U.S. economic underpinning remain, right? The war changed that model, it created fear and uncertainty. But the growth rate in the United States will hit 6% under Donald Trump's leadership. It will hit 6% annual GDP growth under Donald Trump's leadership.
But not this year.
Well, let's see. Let's see. I mean, you have today, if the Straits of Hormuz open.
There's always a band with like the Lutnick thing at the top, and then like you got Treasury down here and the Democrats down here, but you're holding it at 6%?
I am, because I know the commitments of Build in America. That means the factories, you have Micron building a $100 billion fab, right? That's making the chips, literally making the chips. TSMC currently building $165 billion. These are factories making the chips. These are not the data centers. Data centers are buying the chips. We're talking about making the chips, making engines, making cars, this 18 trillion making drugs, $400 billion of onshoring drugs, finally having an industrial policy that allows us to build in America will drive GDP, and it naturally drives it. So I'm not projecting. What I am doing is I'm taking a calculator out that comes free with my phone and putting in the concept. Like, think about it this way. If the president says $18 trillion of build, we have a $30 trillion economy, right? $3 trillion of build is 10%. Okay, 3 trillion is 10%. It's not that hard to hit 6% growth if these shovels get in the ground, right? When they get in the ground is key, but when those shovels hit the ground, you hit 6% GDP growth, whether you like it or not, whether you want to agree or disagree. Shovels. So if you come to my office, I have two big shovels in my office right now.
Okay.
One was a $100 billion build and one was a $32 billion build. When you come to my office and the wall is full of shovels, I promise you we're at 6% GDP growth.
So that's 27, 28. Well, I'll keep an eye on the wall. If you and I had been talking 10 years ago, I think it would have sounded really exotic that you in a Republican administration are advocating for the U.S. government to take stakes in U.S. companies. That is now a model. And I'm curious, do you think that is and some of the companies you were just talking about, the government has a financial interest in, do you think that is like a one-time emergency measure, or is that kind of the new way that the American government will and should operate in the future?
So I have a theory called the benefit of the bargain. Okay? Why would we give Intel a grant of $10 billion to assist them to build in America when the company is worth $100 billion? It's not supposed to be shareholder Christmas.
I mean, that is the American tradition. The answer would have been, because they're an American company.
But it's crazy town. Why wouldn't you get the benefit of the bargain for the American taxpayer? If we're going to give GIVE money to someone, why don't we get something for it, right? And so in the scale, so before I walked in the door, the CHIPS Act, which was $52 billion, had basically a 20% payout model. That means if you were willing to build $10 billion factory in America, the CHIPS Act gave you $2 billion, 20%. So I walked in the door and I thought that was crazy, right? Who would give 20%, like basically giving the full down payment to someone else to build for them, and the American taxpayer is just paying. So we modified that to 4%, right? So we said, I'll still give you the money, but you have to build 25 billion now, right? 35 billion, 45 billion. So we turned, which was a $200 billion build into a $550 billion build. And when Intel couldn't build more, right, because they were a dumpster fire, right? When I walked in the door, they were a dumpster fire, right? This $300, $200, $100 billion company.
Is the fire out? Are they not a dumpster fire now?
The fire's out. We gave them, right, we invested in them, right, in what was it, August?
They're not even a dumpster. They're doing good.
August?
I didn't mean just that the
August, it was $20 a share. Right? Yesterday it was $65 a share. It went from a $100 billion company, $300 billion company. We went from giving Intel $10 billion, the American taxpayer giving Intel $10 billion and getting nothing for it, to owning 450 million shares of their company, or 430 million shares of their company, worth $30 billion for the American taxpayer. It's a swing of $40 billion for the benefit of who? Of us, for our social security system, for our government. And that's a way of thinking that is basically, you put a businessman in the White House. You put a businessman as the Secretary of Commerce. You're going to make money using our economy. You know, the way I say it is, we have $6.5 trillion of spending when I walked in the door. $4.5 trillion of revenue. We lost $2 trillion a year, our economy. We have a $30 trillion economy, and we have $39 trillion of debt. We're going to hell. Except, what if I told you the balance sheet of the United States of America was worth $500 trillion? Now, I say it's worth $500 trillion. Of course, my boss says a quadrillion, because whatever I say, he by definition is going to say double. But because he's just fundamentally more optimistic.
Let me ask you about this.
Does that sound like a bad? It sounds sensational, and you just don't close.
It sounds like a great deal, and I think there's a lot of. I mean, I totally understand the argument. You're getting a better deal for the taxpayer. I think one of the big criticisms of this system, and you're the chairman of the investment committee overseeing a huge chunk of promised Japanese investment. There's a Japanese CEO talking to you in the green room just now. There's obviously a lot of people see the promise. I would say maybe the central worry is you start doing these one-off deals, these one-off relationships, and it just lends itself, whether now or in the future, to a kind of self-dealing crony capitalism. How do you avoid that?
Well, you have in this case, so we have $550 billion of committed capital by the Japanese and $200 billion committed capital by the Koreans as part of the trade.
And you're really personally making the decisions, right?
Well,
you're the chairman of the investment board.
I am the chairman of the investment board. But when we do energy, then of course Chris Wright is sitting next to me. When we use land from Interior,
yep.
then Doug Burgum sits next to me, and everything gets approved by the president. So the model is we have $750 billion to build what we want to build in America. And what do we want to build? We want to build 100 gigawatts of power. We need 100 gigawatts of power, and so the Japanese are funding 100 gigawatts of power. So that's coming, right? So we've already announced $105 billion of projects, right? 9.2 gigawatts of power in Portsmouth. And this is going to rejuvenate, right? And basically, if you think about it just for 1 minute, the industrial policy of the United States of America destroyed basically like upstate New York, had Carrier and all these sort of powers. And where we announced in Portsmouth, that was where Eisenhower built all the nuclear of America, was in Portsmouth. And those communities died with our industrial policy, which basically globalized everything. Build it somewhere else and we'll buy it, right? When you turn that back around, these communities have stranded power. They have huge power infrastructure for all those hulking factories. And what's happening is those factories are going to get rebuilt, right, with new fabs, with new types of technology, and you're going to see these communities regrow. And it's going to be amazing, and that's where that $18 trillion is going. It's going to Onondaga County. It's going to Portsmouth, Ohio. They're going there because they have stranded power infrastructure, and so those old factories are actually a magnet for the new fabs that are coming. And these are going to be, it's a $100 billion fab. It's miles long, 40,000 construction jobs.
Unsold.
25,000 full-time jobs.
I think people love, like, honestly, this is great. I mean, as you see, like, I don't think anybody in either party is going to argue with that, and they love the fab. What do you say to the notion that whether it's your administration, whether it's the Gavin Newsom administration, whatever, Americans get nervous about the idea that that you personally or the president might be saying, you know what, I'll give this deal to my friend and not to my enemy, that rather than the invisible hand of capitalism, it is some people we elected or were appointed doing one-off deals.
The worst thing I learned when I went into government is the sucking sound of how many people try to suck off of the U.S. government. I mean, it's so
Yuck.
Demoralizing to watch that stuff. Look, we are here for outcomes and winners.
Yep.
If you give money to a loser, you're going to have a loser outcome, all right? I want to be proud of what we accomplish.
Yeah.
We're going to give money to winners who are going to win so that I can be proud and this administration can be proud of the outcomes. We're going to build 100 gigawatts of power. We're going to build it. If we don't build it, then we won't have it.
Different question. China talks kick off next month. There are voices in China who want to see Chinese investment in the U.S. and specifically JV BYD factories in the United States. Is that on the table?
No.
Thank you for that answer. I have like 3 more questions I can get in now. Amazing. I've been talking to a lot of your counterparties, other countries. I'm curious, which countries and which negotiators, which teams do you feel like understand the U.S.? Who has been best to work with? Who's been worst to work with?
Well, the Japanese were extraordinary to work with because we have a great cultural divide. And once you understand the cultural divide, and we're willing to put it on the table, you can't open the Japanese car market. You just can't. There's 94% of cars driven in Japan are Japanese. It's cultural, right? The only American cars sold in Japan are Chevys driven by the Yakuza. So if your kid comes home with a Chevy, it's not really going to work for you, right? So once you realize that's not going to open, then we had to come at it with a completely different model, right? The tariff was going to be 25%, well, we've got to come up with a different model. And so they came up with a model that said, we will invest with you in America.
And this is buying down the tariff in some sense?
Not in some sense. We reduced the tariff from 25% to 15%.
Yeah.
Right? In exchange for that, they gave us $550 billion to do construction projects that are absolutely going to get them their money back.
Who else gets it from your perspective? The British, the South Koreans, who's? Well,
it was hard for the Europeans, but they got there. You know, the big deals, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Europeans, and the UK, they got there.
Yeah.
Right? They got there and they understood. Didn't mean it wasn't a lot of talking, but obviously, even in this brief time we have together, you realize I'm not really shy about talking.
Is President Trump, speaking our closer neighbors, is President Trump committed to extending the USMCA ahead of the July deadline?
I think he thinks it's a bad deal, right? He thinks making Mexico and Canada be treated economically like Georgia and Alabama without them actually being committed.
Do you think it might lapse?
Is a bad trade deal.
I
think it needs to be reconsidered and reimagined correctly. There are parts of Mexico that are fundamental to us. There are parts of Canada, you know, their energy and other things that are important to us. But the concept of taking an auto plant out of Ohio and Michigan and putting it in Mexico to break the union and to break our people is nuts. It was a bad industrial policy. It harmed America. President Trump is going to fix it. He's bringing it back. You're going to see it get brought back. And I think it needs to be reimagined and needs to be readdressed. There's plenty of good in it, but there's a huge amount of bad in it and needs to be reconsidered for the benefit of America.
The former top Canadian trade negotiator said the other day that time is on.
Christopher Friedland, who's like the worst?
A guy, I'm blanking on his name here, but